cehenneme çevirdiler. Bütün akrabalarımızı öldürdüler.
Artık son dedik ki bu iş burada noktalanması lazım.
The Turkish border must be controlled by Turkey.
Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. For years, Turkey has called for a buffer zone in northern Syria as war devastated the other side of the 900-kilometer border they share. On Wednesday, Ankara made its most significant move so far towards that goal, and Turkey's involvement in the war moved to the next level. Turkish tanks and special forces crossed into Syria, helping a group of rebels to quickly recapture the town of Jarablus from Daesh. But the operation is not just about pushing back Daesh, it's also about ensuring that the power vacuum created isn't filled by the YPG. They're the Syrian branch of the PKK terror group that's backed by the US. Could this be the turning point for Turkey and the war in Syria? And where does this leave Ankara's relationship with Washington and Moscow? We'll be looking for answers to these questions and many more as we devote this special edition of the Newsmakers to what's being called Operation Euphrates Shield.
Celebrating the liberation of Daesh's last stronghold near Turkey's border. A day-long offensive with the mission to retake Jarablus complete. It began just before dawn. Artillery fire aimed at Daesh targets. Turkish and US jets provided support from above, opening a corridor, and Turkish tanks rolled across the border into Syria. A convoy of Turkish special forces and 1,500 Syrian rebels. The group claimed victory within a few hours, in the first phase of Turkey's first operation on the ground in Syria.
Suriye'den ülkemize, Gaziantep, Kilis, tüm bu bölgelere yapılan bu tür saldırılar artık işi bir yere kadar getirdi.
For Turkey, this operation is about protecting its borders, with the threat now at a breaking point. Jarablus was Daesh's last key territory on Turkey's border. Recapturing the town cuts off its access to Turkey. Daesh has repeatedly fired mortar shells into Turkey and carried out terrorist attacks on its soil. The latest, a wedding in Gaziantep last week that killed more than 50 people. But the offensive is also about stopping the momentum of the YPG, a group Turkey considers the Syrian wing of the PKK terrorist organisation. The YPG has been gaining ground, and earlier this month, it crossed over the Euphrates River to retake Manbij. Turkey is concerned the YPG will take advantage of the vacuum and create a de facto autonomous Kurdish territory right along its border. The YPG has been a key ally to the US-led coalition in its fight against Daesh, but the US has warned it to retreat.
We have made it absolutely clear to the elements that were part of the Syrian Democratic Forces, the YPG that participated, that they must move back across the river. They cannot, will not, and under no circumstances get American support if they do not keep that commitment.
Turkey is now looking to push further and completely cleanse its border region of Daesh militants. And it has said it will do what is necessary to complete its operation. Turkey is now potentially changing the battlefield and raising the stakes in Syria. Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining us now from Karkamish, close to the Syrian border, is TRT World's Ali Mustafa. And with me here is Galib Dalai, Research Director at Asharq Forum. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Ali, you're closer to the heart of what's going on than the rest of us. I see the river behind you. More than 24 hours on since those Turkish tanks and troops and those Syrian opposition fighters crossed the border. What is the current situation in Jarablus and its surrounds?
Intermittent artillery fire Imran, we just heard tank fire emanating from Jarablus, which is a few miles downstream from the river behind me. So the situation remains tense, but the Turkish military says it is now in control. And Free Syrian Army forces are also in control of Jarablus more than 24 hours after pushing Daesh out. But that isn't the only threat, as you mentioned. So is the YPG. The river behind me, the Euphrates River, has once again gained political significance in this conflict. If I can just show our viewers on the east, if you're looking at the river, on the left-hand side, the east of Euphrates is where the YPG has slowly started to retreat. According to the US, this process will be complete by next week. This was a key demand of Turkey, that YPG forces affiliated to the outlawed PKK should remain east of the Euphrates. They crossed over earlier this month as they pushed to retake Manbij. Imran.
Galip, in a nutshell, why is Operation Euphrates Shield necessary, and why is it necessary right now?
Well, it's necessary on the three levels. The first one is related to Turkey's security concern, particularly emanating from the presence of the ISIS along the Turkish border, which has proved quite deadly, which has proved quite perilous and dangerous, as a recent attack in Gaziantep has shown us clearly. 54 dead and over 90 people wounded. And this is not the only attack that Turkey has experienced. This is one of the many attacks that Turkey has suffered in recent years. And plus Turkey has also experience, Turkey's border towns along the border has experienced many shelling of the ISIS artillery. The second reason is that once the YPG took over the Manbij, it turns its face towards two directions. One of them is the west, and another one is north. North towards the Turkish border, west towards the connecting basically the remaining gap between the Kobani canton and the Afrin canton. Turkey, for Turkey, YPG is the part of the PKK. PKK is a designated terrorist organization by Turkey, US, and EU, Europe, and Turkey has repeatedly said that it will not tolerate the PKK wings, YPG in Syria, to create territorial contiguity along its border, basically to cover all its border with Syria. So that was, a danger there, and Turkey felt that it needed to respond to that.
And I guess the clarity is in the name.
Exactly.
Euphrates Shield.
Euphrates
so
Shield.
keeping everything east of the Euphrates.
Exactly. That's exactly
out, right?
Exactly. The key demand is that the YPG should not be allowed to be present on the west side of the Euphrates, and it should go back to the eastern side of the Euphrates. And the third one is related to the position of the Syrian opposition. With the YPG is on the a bit down from the border, and the ISIS is along the border in Jarablus. The Syrian opposition felt squeezed, and the corridor between Aleppo and Turkey was increasingly in danger. So by this attack, Turkey wants to make sure that this corridor towards Aleppo is safe and secure, and it will also, in a sense, create a breathing space for the Syrian opposition.
Breathing space for the Syrian opposition and those opposition fighters. Ali, on the ground, tell us a little bit more about the makeup of those opposition fighters and the different groups that they come from.
The Free Syrian Army, which has taken over Jarablus, this is a force that has been patronized by Turkey, by the US for some time as well. The fighters that took over Jarablus, we are being told, are mostly from Jarablus itself, and they were quite joyous when they entered the town almost after 2 years since Daesh had been in control, Imran.
Ali, tell me a bit about the morale amongst the Turkish soldiers who were a part of that operation. Are they considering this a success so far? 'Cause, 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 'cause,
Well, it's hard to discern the morale of the Turkish forces. It's a professional fighting force and it doesn't easily give away its emotions. But the Turkish military has been waiting for this moment for 5 years. It has been sitting on the sidelines, and military commanders tell TRT World, tell us that they were prepared to go in for quite some time, but were waiting for orders from superiors.
Galip, one of the reasons I asked that is because there's some thinking that this is all the more important given the failed coup a month ago to show unity, to boost the morale of the troops, to show that this army is an organized fighting force that stands together. Is that correct?
Well, let's not forget, one of the coup plotters, one of the coupists that was arrested is the commander that was in charge of Turkey's border with Syria and Iraq. So the person that was in charge of protecting Turkey's border with Syria was actually one of the guys that participated in the coup attempt. And right aftermath, the fact that right now Turkey can undertake an effective operation inside Syria shows to the society that once the Turkish army is basically cleared of these rogue elements, it can be a much more effective fighting force, and therefore the prestige and the morale that the Turkish army, the prestige of the Turkish army has suffered significantly after the coup attempt. And now it is like, regaining this prestige. It is once again like, raising the Turkish army's morale and also like, giving the impression that Turkish army has not lost its capacity as a fighting force as a result of this purge within the army, this purge of the coup plotters. So in this regard, it was a very significant message, both aimed at the society, but also a significant message, not just from the political class, but also from the military, showing that it is a capable fighting force, and actually its unity remains intact and probably is even strengthened after these rogue elements was cleared of the army.
Okay, Galip, don't go away. We're going to broaden this out in a moment or two. Ali, before I let you go, one final question for you. Are we getting any time scale from the military? Are they giving any hints or suggestions for as to how long this operation will last for?
Well, just to give you an idea, Imran, as we move closer to the border, Kirkamesh and Jarablus, we saw at least 20 to 25 more tanks, about M60A3 tanks of the Turkish military that were preparing to go into Syria. It isn't unclear if they will be sent in, but these preparations are underway close to the border. So we might be looking at quite some time till the Turkish military is based, at least in Jarablus and the vicinity.
Okay, Ali Mustafa, take care of yourself. You're doing great work for us. Thank you very much for joining us there from the border. Now, let's just broaden this out for a moment or two, because there's all sorts of geopolitical permutations here. The United States is involved, Russia is involved, allies and enemies and those in between. Everybody has a stake, and all against the backdrop of a war raging in Syria. Randolph Nogel has more.
It came as little surprise. Turkish boots on the ground in northern Syria had been anticipated for months. But what impact increasing Turkish engagement will have on Syria's war is not yet clear. Turkey is allied with the US-led coalition in the effort to defeat Daesh.
We hope to continue to work with Turkey closely on continued operations that will root out Daesh, but we're supportive of the operation.
U.S. Vice President Joe Biden is in Turkey to reassure Ankara that the U.S. supports the elected government in the face of last month's attempted coup. But also at issue is U.S. support for YPG militants. Turkey says they're allied with the PKK terror group, which has fought Turkey's government for 30 years to establish an independent Kurdish state. And Turkey's recent reconciliation with Russia, which has supported the Assad regime in Syria to the dismay of the West, adds further complexity to the ever-shifting dynamics of the Syrian conflict. It was the moment Turkish-Russian relations spiraled. In November last year, Turkish warplanes shot down a Russian fighter jet near the Turkish-Syrian border, saying it invaded its airspace.
Today's tragic event will have significant consequences, including for the relations between Russia and Turkey.
But 8 months later, the two nations repaired relations. And next week, Russian President Vladimir Putin will visit Turkey for the first time since the incident. The US and other Western nations are trying to put pressure on Russia over its game-changing role in the Syrian conflict. Ever since Moscow began launching airstrikes in Syria, the Assad regime has made significant gains, including in Syria's second city, Aleppo. Russia is accused of targeting Free Syrian Army forces, which the US supports in their efforts to topple Assad. And while Washington accuses Moscow of targeting US-backed rebel forces, Moscow says it's targeting Daesh. But even if Daesh is in the end defeated, the future of Syria still hangs in the balance. Peace talks and ceasefires have repeatedly failed. And then there's the question of Bashar al-Assad's role in the future of Syria. 5 years on, the man and his regime at the vortex of a security vacuum that continues to draw more foreign influence into Syria's war. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Moscow is Maria Lipman, the editor-in-chief of Counterpoint Journal, published by George Washington University. And from Washington, D.C., Richard White, the director and senior fellow of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. Galip Delay is also still with us. Thanks for joining us. Richard White, let me start with you. The U.S. is providing air cover for this operation. Daesh is a mutual enemy, so I guess there's no contradiction there. But the YPG has been a U.S. ally of sorts for a while. We've even seen U.S. soldiers wearing their patches in recent times. Is the U.S. policy regarding this operation consistent, in your opinion?
Well, it's hard to have a totally consistent policy towards Syria, given all the cross-cutting alliances and regional connections and so on. I mean, the U.S. policy is logical, let's put it that way. The U.S. is trying to sustain good relations with Turkey, limit Russian influence in the region, weaken the Assad regime, but without allowing the more extremist terrorists to take charge. And the Kurds are a useful partner for some of those efforts, but the main concern is that the Kurdish issue will serve as a wedge to weaken Turkish-U.S. ties and could be exploited by Russia, Iran, and the Syrian government to try and pull Turkey away from the coalition. So it's a logical policy. I don't know if it's totally consistent, but I can't really think of a consistent policy that would line up all the interests and players in the way you'd like to see them.
Something that Richard said was interesting, Maria, was that part of the U.S. policy is not allowing the more extreme elements or extreme terrorists from among the opposition to take control. That's where the U.S. and Russia have differed over the years, because the United States has seen al-Nusra and Daesh as terrorists, whereas Russia has seen all of the opposition forces as terrorists. But in response to this operation by Turkey, the Russians in their response haven't called the FSA and other rebels working with Turkey terrorists as they usually do. They've just called them opposition fighters, Maria. How significant is that? Are we seeing the Russians sort of on board with the American policy now?
Well, that would be taking it too far. But it is true that the Russian reaction to the current Turkish operation has been restrained. The language in Russia was not too harsh. Russia expressed deep concern and called routinely, as it has over the years, to a diplomatic political solution. However, the language was not harsh, and the reaction overall was restrained. The official pro-Kremlin media, as well as news agencies, were very brief and matter-of-fact regarding this operation. So even if the operation does not make Russia happy, Russia does not want to aggravate and does not want to express extreme disagreement with what is going on. And indeed, the word opposition instead of terrorists is something that makes this reaction different. Again, just as American policy, Russia's has not been consistent all along. The conflict has lasted so long now that it's only natural that they've been maneuvering.
Yeah, and Galip, as we mentioned, the YPG, US ally, being targeted by Turkey now, the US providing air cover, and the US also saying, you know, we've told those guys to stay on the east of the Euphrates, you cross west and you won't have our support anymore. Their political leader, the PYD leader, Saleh Muslim, tweeted that Turkey is in a Syrian quagmire and will be defeated as Daesh. I mean, is there a fear here, a realistic and genuine fear amongst Turkish decision makers that we might get sucked into something that we'll find very difficult to get out of?
Well, that has been one of the principles that has guided Turkey's policy all the way around. And look at look at Iran. Among the major players in the Syrian crisis at regional and the international level, Turkey probably has been the most cautious one. Iran is actively on the ground. Russia is on the ground, US is on the ground. The only country actually that is not on the ground, that did not go on the ground, was Turkey. So Turkey was very conscious and very cautious in terms of not to get bogged down in Syria. And when you look at the current incursion, it seems to be quite well crafted, and it seems to be like it has a limited scope in terms of the area that it is targeting. It has a limited scope in terms of the groups that it is targeting. But nevertheless, any incursion into a war zone is not risk-free. So it is one thing that you have a calculation. It is another thing whether your calculation will meet the reality on the ground. So for the timing, I don't see a major risk of Turkey, having an operation going out of the hand, and then, in a sense, like getting bogged down in Syria. But you cannot completely rule out this option. As I just said, it is a war-torn country. It is it has been rocked by a civil war, and in the end, your calculation can perfectly go awry. But for the time being, as I said, I think Turkey is very much cautious about this aspect, this threat, this risk, and that's why it is trying to basically keep the focus of this operation very limited in terms of the geographical area that it is going to focus on, and also in terms of the group that is going to fight against and the group that is going to help with. So for the time being, it is a calculated risk that Turkey is taking.
Richard White, at the genesis of what the US wants here, are they just looking at whoever can get rid of Daesh in the best way possible? And if Turkey is busy, routing them in towns that they control, all the better for everyone?
I wouldn't make it that monocausal or single purpose. I think that what's happening is there is a intense concern to limit the role of Daesh and al-Nusra in Iraq, Syria, the whole region. And there is also a desire to remove Assad from power, since he's seen as the cause of some of the civil disturbances, at least in Syria. There is a desire to work with Russia, but also limit Russian influence. There's a desire to sustain a strong Turkish partnership, which has been under strain for a variety of reasons. Desire to meet EU concerns about refugees. So there are a whole bunch of streams. I mean, certainly an immediate concern is defeating any terrorist group that's able to strike at the United States or Europe or even Turkey, and Daesh is a leading candidate for that.
Maria, Syria is complaining that its sovereignty is being violated. I mean, tanks and troops did cross its border without its permission. Does it have a point at all?
Well, of course it does. This is Syrian territory, but it's a territory that's torn by war, and various forces are now fighting there. What I would point out that this particular language, violation of sovereignty, is missing in the Russian reaction, unlike the reaction from the Syrian government, and this in itself is important. I think this current advance has created some, I would say, very brittle, but maybe ground for some sort of a joint solution. I'm not saying it's there, it's very brittle, it may fall apart, but there is a sense that parties involved in this conflict, I mean external parties, are really keen to find a solution to the crisis that has raged for 5 years now.
Galip, brittle possible joint solution? Is everything that we're seeing maybe the beginning of a broad consensus among the United States, amongst Russia, amongst Iran, Turkey, and so on? Or are we finding patterns that don't exist?
Well, I mean, one of the general feelings that we see with everyone is that some kind of solution that needs to be, find out for this crisis. It has been going on for too long, and it is costing everyone very much. And also, right now there is another recognition: no one is going to emerge from this crisis as a winner. Everyone is going to lose out from this crisis, and everyone is going to come out of this crisis with, to some extent, weakened. But right now the question is who is going to lose more? And I think if you go down this path, it is a dead end. What I see right now, there is some kind of consensus. There is some kind of consensus between the U.S. and Russia on the very general framework of the what a post-crisis political solution look like. Some of the trends that I see is one of them, well, it should be a secular government. It should be unitary, but a decentralized government, and the rights and liberties of the minorities that needs to be protected. This is more or less the 3 points that I see that U.S. and Russia can agree upon. Another thing that I see that U.S. and Russia can agree upon is the use of the use of the terrorism as a bargaining chip, as a threatening chip against anyone that will not follow the line. Mm-hmm. This is particularly, I think, they will use this particularly against the opposition and simply threatening the opposition. If you don't follow the line, you can perfectly be conceptualized, you can perfectly be named as a terrorist organization and then bear the consequences.
Okay, unfortunately, time is our mutual enemy. Galip, Maria, and Richard, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. You've been watching this special edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. As always, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.